spent 10 days at the end of June on a family vacation in Vietnam. We ran the entire length of the country, Ho Chi Minh City, otherwise known as Saigon, to Hue, to HoiAn, to Hanoi, to Halong Bay, and then back to Ho Chi Minh City for our flight home. It's a long country, Vietnam is, about the length of California, so this itinerary didn't allow us to get deep, go in depth in any one place, but we did get a good overview of Vietnam. After returning to the U.S., I had a lot of questions about the trip, but the one that everyone asks is, how did they treat you when they found out you were from America? Well, the short answer is, fine. We didn't feel the need to hide our nationality, add an A at the end of every sentence to pass as a Canadian. And when we handed over our passports to hotel clerks or told car drivers that we were from the U.S., we never felt any animosity or saw any change in demeanor. Everyone was friendly. Indeed, the only anti-Americanism we saw was where you'd most expect it, on displays at the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, and in the introductory video for the Chu Chi Tunnels, a park that commemorates the Viet Cong guerrilla efforts. But never from the people we ran into, our tour guides or drivers. At My Son, a sort of mini Angkor Wat in central Vietnam, south of Da Nang, our guide mentioned that some of the temples were destroyed by B-52 bombs, not in an accusing way, just a statement of fact about something that happened some 40 years ago. Indeed, the bigger disconnect seemed to be between the South Vietnamese who had served in the war and the rest of today's Vietnam. There seemed both a political and generational divide. I had to wonder how our Saigon guide, a former Vietnamese army officer, how he felt taking us through exhibits that insulted him and lionized his enemies.
We got a problem by the landmine before too. We got a wounded. We stayed in the hospital for a month. My next young brother was killed.
A couple of years ago, when we vacationed in Singapore and Phuket, Thailand, I joked with my family that we were only doing Asia Light. Well, I'll tell you, starting in Ho Chi Minh City, still called Saigon by many, it's full contact Asia. 9 million people, 10 million motorbikes, and where crossing the street has been elevated to an extreme sport. Starting here was definitely jumping into the deep end, and it wasn't until we came back the second time, a couple of days before leaving the country, that we began to feel comfortable with Saigon. Now, unlike Delhi or Joburg or Rio, I didn't see the abject poverty in shanty towns in Saigon that I've seen in those other cities, nor did I feel as unsafe. Now, we mostly stayed in District 1, the main tourism area, but walking back to our hotel at night after dinner and after some evening shopping, it just wasn't a problem. It wasn't a second thought. HoiAn is kind of like a Vietnamese Williamsburg, a preserved historic port town and a UNESCO World Heritage Site with no war damage. The old town is really for tourists. The historic buildings now house tailor shops, art galleries, trinket shops, bars, restaurants. It can't be all that interesting for the locals, but it is a sort of Vietnam light for tourists weary of the press of Saigon. I was pleasantly surprised with Hanoi. I had heard that it was cold to Americans, which would have been understandable, but I didn't see anything like that. At only 4 million people, Hanoi seemed less crazy, easier to manage than Saigon. Motorbikes stop at traffic lights, and crossing the street didn't generate sort of the same fight or flight response that it did in Ho Chi Minh City. After a half-day drive east of Hanoi, we ended up cruising Halong Bay for 2 days on a 10-passenger replica of a Chinese pirate junk. Okay, potentially a little kitschy, but it was a great boat. Weaving through the limestone islands or karsks, visiting a floating fishing and oyster farming village. The scenery and pace, there was a stark difference from what had been, up to this point, a very urban vacation. Now, we love Vietnamese food, so eating was a real highlight of the trip. One could say it was a main focus of the trip. The variety was great. We really didn't eat the same thing twice, except for pho, the classic noodle dish, but that was by choice. I mean, I ate pho for breakfast almost every day, and for dinner or last night in Saigon, pho for 4, 2 Tiger beers, 2 Cokes, $10. I mean, it was the perfect last meal. I'm glad we went to Vietnam when we did, because it's starting to get crowded with tourists, Australians, French, and a growing number of Chinese. The drive south from Da Nang to Hoi An along China Beach, we saw hotel after resort after timeshares all under construction. You got to think once those things fill in 18 to 36 months, it's just going to flood the place with tourists. But right now seems to be a sweet spot. I mean, there's enough business to support a good tourism industry, but it's not yet completely overrun, and so the people still seem happy to welcome new visitors, even Americans.